have to be living room conversations. But this is the only formal time, Noam. Thank you very much for doing this. And I'm really looking forward to it. And I've invited a lot of your co-authors. I connected with a lot of them. I put it out. I sent them Zoom link, and let's hope some of them could join us. Some said they will. And I said, whatever time, even for a short while. So Noam, thank you very much. And yeah.
Thank you for inviting me, and thank you for inviting my co-authors. Each of them has a story to tell. Each of them, both inside of Star Wars and this book and outside of Star Wars and this book, each of them are people doing wonderful work out there in the world on conflict and conflict-related topics. So please keep doing that.
Perfect. But I think what is going to happen is, I mean, of course, the series Talking Books came up because I don't read books, and I said talking books because some of us don't read them. It came from there. Now, and Star Wars, I saw the first one, maybe we were very young. So now you've got a very interesting combination. Someone who doesn't read books and someone who might not have, I won't even remember that. So what I did, Noam, was I said, let's get someone to help us. So whom have I got to help us? ChatGPT. Okay, so I was putting out things to ChatGPT, but we'll also maybe I'll take it from there. So that's going to be the interesting part.
That's wonderful, and I'll just say it's so interesting that's the way you chose this morning. Last night I posted on a dispute resolution listserv for professors and teachers of dispute resolution. We hadn't yet discussed ChatGPT or hadn't much mentioned ChatGPT and all of the developments around it. And just last night, I ran, a popular simulation game for teaching mediation and negotiation, particularly through ChatGPT. I asked it to analyze it, and I just put it out there on the listserv and asked, folks, what do you think? And, how is it? How do we think this is going to affect our field? And I put through several iterations of, depending on how you tweak the question that you ask it, what type of analysis would it bring? Is sort of bringing us all to the point at which we realize, hey, we should sit up and take notice, and a wonderful discussion developed on the chat. So on that listserv. So I'm very much in that space. So let's see what you and ChatGPT have to ask me. And before that, I just want to say, Vikram, I am a huge fan of the work you've been doing over the past 2-3 years. It's just wonderful. You're bringing everybody both into your living room and out there into the world, and bringing people together in symposia in different ways and on different topics. It's lovely. It's wonderful. I don't know where you get the energy, but don't stop.
I know I should not stop, but of course there are times when you feel that, am I putting out too much? Because you can imagine, I mean, there are now, I think, 487 videos, and none of them will be less than an hour, maybe very few of them. So they've gone up to 3 hours and 4 hours. So there's lots of content out there, and I just feel that maybe I should give people time to watch this. But I can't. But the only problem is I can't stop. There are things coming up.
The only question, the limitation is your soul. When is it feeding your soul, and when is it grating and you're getting tired? So of course, the wonderful thing about these things is that these videos will be around forever, right? So if 10 people watch them today, or 100 people watch them tomorrow, or only even one, another one will watch it tomorrow or in a year, or and that way we just keep. Yeah.
One of the very interesting things you've just said, because yesterday only I was having a conversation with someone. I was asking someone, she should be part of some show of mine, and she asked me, well, what is your audience size? Okay, let me give you the answer that I gave. I would have actually taken a screenshot, but maybe that's like might take a little bit of time there. So I said, it's wonderful to hear that you've had a great experience about India. So that's it, the India part. The recording of your show will be available on my YouTube channel, hopefully for posterity. We don't know how many people you'll inspire. Even if one person gets inspired and we get our next Ken Cloak, that's all that matters.
That's right. That's wonderful.
So, but what I want to do is just let's put up the book first. Let's share this first. This is what we're talking about. And of course, I mean, the lots of authors, co-authors, I mean, our contributors, I would say. So
Yes.
you want to just talk about how this came up? I mean, of course, you being a fan of Star Wars definitely the starting point, but then how did this whole thing come up and all?
I will, but first of all, every time I see the cover of the book, I just want to give a shout out to the cover art designer Karen Prius, who did a fantastic job. And every time I see the cover, I say, "Oh, I can't believe that's my book." Um,
But yeah,
I
you can talk about that also. You can talk about the cover, what she's put in there. Let's. Yeah.
well, you can notice we wanted to have Star Warsy elements, but without ripping off Star Wars and Disney intellectual property. So we have things that are reminiscent and evoke Star Wars, like the sort of schematics of a Death Star and of a TIE fighter, which is one of the battle planes, outer space planes, spaceships that are fought in. And then lots of outer space and a planet, and on that planet you can see um, different terms from the book, sort of emanating up into space, and some of those terms are conflict and negotiation terms, uh, and some of them are Star Wars terms, and some of them are a mix. Uh, so and it's hard to know where some of those start and some of those end. Like the term in-group out-group affiliation bias is it's a cognitive bias conflict term. But the term dark side emotions is a mixture of Star Wars and conflict resolution. We know emotions play such a powerful role in conflict resolution. What role do emotions from the dark side play in conflict resolution? We don't talk about that too much. We talk about being frustrated. We talk about people being annoyed. We talk less about people being furious. We talk less about people being fearful. Um, and in Star Wars, these are key themes. It's a key theme that sort of the great Jedi Master Yoda sort of led the path to the dark side, introducing how uh, uh, anger leads to fear leads to suffering, and so on. There's like a path that leads you through to the dark side. So this is a mixture of the movie and the science as they pertain to conflict resolution. So I just wanted to give credit where credit is due. More credit, I'll note the book was published by DRI Press at the Mitchell Hamlin School of Law. They specialize in dispute resolution publications only, and have been a wonderful partner throughout. Particularly, one way in which they've been a wonderful partner is they agreed with us straight out that um, this is a book that's written for everybody. And I'm sort of contrasting that. I resonated with what you said about one viewer, right? One viewer who knows that might be the next Ken Cloak, as you said, right? And that could be. And we celebrate every reader of this book, but our audience for the book was everybody. And that everybody, in this case, it's limited sort of to some extent by everybody who is a Star Wars fan or enough of a Star Wars, with enough Star Wars affinity to to know the basic gist of some of the movies and be able to jump into the book and read. And the idea is that every mediator and every mediation teacher and every mediation student and negotiation student has at one point said the following words: "Hey, we all need to learn some of this. This has so much to do with my life, not just my professional whatever. We all need to know some of this." And for the longest time, I've been wondering, so how do we teach some of this to everybody? And I've done some work in that in the past, some work that I've done together with Chris Honeyman, who maybe you've had already as a speaker, and if not, then you should certainly invite him on. And other ideas in different topics. I taught a MOOC, an internet massive open online course on negotiation that hundreds or thousands of students could join, trying to figure out sort of methods for and this this time around, or this mechanism for doing it, is something that I developed together with my partner on this book and in this wider project, Jen Reynolds from the University of Oregon School of Law. And we share this desire to develop everybody's conflict literacy or conflict fluency. Just a little bit more knowledge and understanding of how to address conflict. And the question is, but how do you reach everybody? Because not everybody knows they want to study it. Not everybody's motivated to study it. In fact, studying conflict sounds like a real downer. So the idea we developed was, people don't want to necessarily study conflict, but millions and millions and millions of people around the world are avid consumers of popular culture. And that popular culture, it can be different around the world. It can just yesterday, I heard about this movie. I can't remember its name, but this movie, an Indian movie that refuses to go away. It's been playing in theaters for the past 30 years. Perhaps you're familiar with it, and it's just being made into a play.
Okay. I mean, I'm guessing this might be the two movies which have gone. I mean, they've been there. One is, of course, one is a little older. One is called Sholay, which was running for a very long time. The other one is Dilwale Dulhaniya Le Jayenge. That's a romance situation there. So maybe
Yes.
that one. But there's one theater in Mumbai which has been running for that many years. I don't know how many years they're running it. So we have these cult movies.
Yeah, and the point is that so many people have seen these artifacts, whether it's these movies or a Star Wars movies, or superhero movies, or television phenomenon like Game of Thrones, other movies like Lord of the Rings. It could be books, right? But there are these cultural phenomena that millions of people both are familiar with, and millions of people are also deeply connected with. And if you could somehow connect that to conflict resolution, you might be able to make it really easy and inviting for fans of those phenomena to really want to read a book. Hey, I wonder, this sounds interesting. Yep. I didn't necessarily get up in the morning and say, I want to go study a master's program in conflict resolution, but that sounds like an interesting twist on Star Wars or on anything else. And so we decided to do Star Wars first, and we have other ideas to follow.
Great, good. So there are lots other coming. That's the interesting part, because I mean, connecting. Of course, I'm not so much of a movie person, but I think this is really an interesting thing, because there was someone from Canada, Helen Lightstone, who was in one of my events, and she's writing some book, and she's picking up various movies, and she's, I think, looking at how things happened there, or how things could have happened there. I don't know how it's going to pan out, but
wonderful.
So I think that's a very interesting way to get to people, to get them to connect to something which is. Oh, but you have to tell us in terms of your family. You said, look, I had to explain that. I like that part that you wrote there about explaining what I do to my children and my family, and this was that was interesting.
When you're a mediator, and you are a mediator, it's in your name, right? But so many people still don't know what we do. And so many people think, to the extent that they think they know what we do, they often don't get it right. And it has always been surprising to me and frustrating to some extent, but also endearing in ways that people around me, I could explain what I do, and they sort of got it, but by the time I would meet them next, or get into a conversation about work next, they would revert to thinking about me, let's say, as a lawyer, which I used to be. Excuse me. And I realized that, if that's how things are at home, we've all encountered that in the mediation room, right? Those situations in the mediation room where you've been in the room working for an hour, and after an hour, parties tell us, wait, what? You mean you're not going to decide for us? And you have this, oh, what have we been doing here? And I think that's an issue that can be addressed the more conflict literacy people have. In other words, this book and books like it can serve a purpose not just of sort of educating the general public to be able to deal with their own conflicts more constructively. A second layer of that is that the more they're able to think about constructive dealing with conflict, perhaps the more likely they are to take a conflict that they can't manage to a mediator instead of to a lawyer or to a court. And a third level of that involves how these parties will engage in the room. The more conflict literacy they have. If they have more conflict literacy, then perhaps we won't need to re-explain to them after an hour that no, we're not going to decide for you. We're going to help you work things out, but you're going to be making the decisions here, because they'll already know that. Now, it might be that they learned about it because they learned about this in a conflict involving, two Star Wars figures and someone trying to mediate between them. That doesn't matter. But they'll bring that to the room. So I think that this does service on all sorts of levels, both to the general population and also to the mediation and conflict resolution writ large professions. We're empowering and training to some extent the general public to be more willing and also more skilled participants in our mediation rooms. And maybe we'll discover other purposes along the way. We've been discovering a lot along the way.
The interesting thing about your opening it out to people, the fact that even when you say mediation room, I'm opening that out and saying, why do we have to even say room? Why not bring people under the tree? Well, let it become a process which they connect on a very informal basis. So that, I think, is something which, I mean, just these discussions around the process and how people can actually connect to it on a different level. But of course, how you've taken it in your book, you have to, I mean, look, now this is where the challenge lies for you. Like I said, here is a person whom you can't connect on the movie.
Right.
How do we do that? What we'll do is, I don't know about you to talk about your chapters. Let's just see what Chat GPT had to say. Let's see
Go for it.
how I told Chat GPT, please write a book on Star Wars and conflict resolution.
Yeah, I did too. Let's see what you got.
No, basically, of course, it said, look, let me put it out. Look, I can't write a book, but I can tell you what chapters you should have there. Let me I was just having a conversation with it. I think we're going to have conversations with Chat GPT. What are we doing? Okay, let's see now.
We're learning.
Yeah, no, good. It's good fun. I found it really enjoyable, but only thing is sometimes you have to push it for certain answers.
Right.
I mean, you have to. There was one discussion I was having on neutrality with it. So,
right.
Of course, it always starts with, okay, this is the mediator has to be neutral. Then I had to have a conversation. Does it have to be neutral? Because I had a whole symposium on that.
So. I know. And let me also add, first of all, and please take the opportunity to plug. I'm sure that symposium is still available on your YouTube channel, and people should definitely watch it. And I'll say that it's interesting how, just as you said, like I had to tweak the question, or I had to prompt it to sort of get to answers. It's fascinating to me how essentially Chat GPT and other programs, but I noticed it, Chat GPT is teaching us how to speak with it. Not overtly, right? But we put something in, we don't get the response we want. We think, well, what is missing? What direction does it need? And then you adapt and you say something different. It is communicating with us and telling us in a way how to engage with it. And I just find that remarkable on all sorts of level. On one interesting level, it switches the roles. We're not teaching it. It's teaching us. So how are we as learners?
I know here I was I was in a way pushing things into its mind about neutrality. I really wanted to push it there. So I said, look, because according to me, it's learning. With what we are telling Chat GPT, definitely is good to next time someone puts that query, hopefully this aspect that I put out there may be taken up in that situation. So I'm in a way, so I want to influence it. I don't know whether that's the right word, but I'm trying to, okay, this is just writing. Okay, this is how it started. I mean, I just put it again.
Right. So one really interesting thing is that I got different answers from ChatGPT, and the interesting thing is that people who aren't familiar with it should know that when you put in a question, you'll get different answers every time. That's one of the wonderful things about it. It's as if it just starts thinking anew and comes up with different answers.
Yep.
So why don't you put that up and let's take a look at some of that, and we'll see how much.
Because look, maybe also it took from the fact that I started off talking about mediation and all that. Maybe it picked up from there also.
Certainly.
So how do you look at it? Let's see. This is
so introduce the topic of conflict resolution, its importance in the Star Wars movies. Absolutely, that's in its introduction. Provide a brief overview of the Star Wars franchise. No, we didn't do that. Our assumption was that readers would be Star Wars fans. Perhaps we should have done that. We've considered that. We've recognized that there are many people out there who, just like you, vaguely remember one or two of the movies, but perhaps feel like they're not really able to jump in, and with all the names and the characters and the story twists, and perhaps an introduction on that would actually have been helpful to mediate between them and the material. Explain how the book will explore the different forms of conflict resolution. Absolutely. Okay, so then sections on mediation, on negotiation, they give specific examples.
Have you dealt with this? Did you deal with this? Have you dealt? I don't know the movie. I mean, I don't know
right.
whether. Look, no, we have to be careful also. ChatGPT sometimes puts things, as I've been told, which are not factually correct. That's what I've been told.
And that is much the case here. As in these two examples that it gave, they're both either wrong or imprecise, largely wrong. So these negotiations didn't take place.
Perfect. That's important to clarify. I think that's really important to clarify.
Yeah. But fit in any other negotiations that did take place, and the questions that they pose there: analyze the factors that contribute to success or failure, examine the role of diplomacy and negotiation. Certainly, that is certainly it. The role of compassion, the role of dialogue. Absolutely. I mean, these are themes that run through the book. The struggle between good and evil is, it's always in there, because you can't discuss really any Star Wars and any of these epoch movies that are all essentially in the end of the struggle between good and evil. But in the end, the book isn't a philosophical book. There are, by the way, wonderful books on Star Wars and philosophy. There have been 3 volumes of them so far. They are an inspiration to the format we chose in writing Star Wars and conflict resolution. So I really urge anyone who's interested in philosophy, and philosophy that's presented in a sort of a light and humorous but sharp and interesting manner through pop culture. There's a whole series of pop culture and philosophy, 3 volumes on Star Wars, as I said. Family conflicts. So we discuss family conflicts in all sorts of ways, because the film is filled with the Skywalker family and its conflicts. We did not have a chapter focusing specifically on the unique nature of family conflict. We do have someone who has promised to write a proposal on that for our second upcoming book. And we're looking forward. It's such a central theme in Star Wars. And then offered a conclusion. Look, this would be a legit basic book on Star Wars and conflict resolution.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, look, why I'm very interested is because of course, with ChatGPT, is because this is going to be picked up by people. A lot of things are going to be picked up from there, and let them also see that, look, what Noam brings in and what co-authors have brought in or co-contributors have brought in is so much larger. And it's not that, because this is going to be, I mean, this is an argument or discussion we are going to keep having about AI. I mean, I'm sure there are lots of other things coming into play. So people have to be careful that, look, here maybe a larger perspective is available out there. Don't limit yourself, because maybe you can just pick this up and take it forward and say, this is it. But there's so much more which you are going to tell us about.
And Vikram, I'm going to use that sort of to segue into answering your previous a question or theme about the authors and the chapters and the content. We just that idea of there's more out there, and don't limit yourself is exactly the theme that Jen Reynolds and I adopted when we decided to create this book. You know, we are both Star Wars fans from, you know, ever since we were children, and we know the movies backwards and forwards to an embarrassing extent. And we could have each, jointly or separately, written a book on Star Wars and conflict resolution. And there's a chance that if we had done it, it would have come out to be a relatively structured book, perhaps structured along the lines of a typical textbook on negotiation and conflict resolution. Here are the major topics. We will discuss them through Star Wars, or discuss Star Wars through them, as we largely did in this book. But at some point in our planning, and we deliberated this for a long time. At some point, we decided that we preferred to go with an edited book, and invite people to propose their ideas for what would make an interesting chapter in a book on Star Wars and conflict resolution. And as soon as we did, by doing that, we relinquished a great deal of control over the book in terms of structure and content. Of course, we made choices in the end, of course, and we did structure things in orders and categories, but we essentially said there is so much more potentially out there than what we would come up with. So let's open it up to the world and see what the world comes up with. And I can't even begin to say how joyful I am that we did it. And I mean, that's sort of, it mirrors, you know, a certain style of mediation, of course, of the just letting a process happen and then steering it in a constructive manner, but not trying to be overly directive, and not trying to you know, control outcome, and not starting off by throwing your own suggestions into the pot and seeing what happens. And we received proposals from about probably about 70 proposals from about 60 people, perhaps more people, because some of them were team efforts, on such a wide variety of ideas. Some of them very basic negotiation and conflict resolution themes, others themes that we would never have imagined. And the people who provided these ideas were from just about any discipline you can imagine that pertains somehow to conflict. We spread the call for paper very widely, you know, not just in like an immediate network. We spread it very, very widely. And the authors in the book, in the end, 25 authors participated in creating the book, and they come from fields of law, of management, social psychology, organizational psychology, organizational behavior, communications. I know I don't know what I'm forgetting, but other fields, including fields that we hadn't known existed, such as a subfield of management called meeting science. I didn't know there was a science of meetings until we received these proposals. Most of them are academics, but we received a lot of proposals from practitioners as well, and we welcomed those. And most of the people who wrote are, you know, as many people in our field are both. So it straddles that as well.
Yeah.
And in the end, we had to make choices. We had to make choices, and the choices were not made based on what the best chapters are quality-wise, because we hadn't seen the chapters. We just asked people for their ideas. Some people submitted a 1-page, some people a 3-page, others 2 paragraphs. That's all we asked for for that first book. And we just chose the ideas that would fit together best in this first effort at a book and provide some structure of a very basic sort. Half the book on conflict and half the book on resolution. So the first half is dynamics of conflict and elements of conflict, the role of emotions, the role of power, the role of identity, and other conflict escalation, other topics that along those lines. And the second half are basic introductions to the primary processes for resolving conflict. So negotiation, mediation, arbitration, and then chapters that either are more advanced or specific chapters in those areas, such as on communication, different tactics, dirty tactics, and dealing with them in negotiation, and other specific topics in the sphere of resolution. That's the book.
No, but what I need to do is I have to ask people maybe to put in questions, because I might not know what questions to ask you on the subject matter for certain situations, certain family conflicts, what all of you've dealt with. But let me just say, Sophie saying beautiful, attractive, and meaningful cover. And Melanie is giving a fun fact: wedding anniversary, May the 4th be with you. May the force be with you. That's what Melanie's put out there. And of course, look, I mean, the younger generation, I mean, are we at some point, are you coming out with something where the younger generation gets involved and how they look at the movie and conflict resolution? Is that also an option?
So I can answer that in two ways. One is, this book is really intended for I'd say anyone from 12 to 120, and that speaks to the notion. And one of the reasons to choose Star Wars is that it's so multi-generational. It has this sticking power that it has been around for 45 years already. My father took me to see the first movie when I was 4 years old. More recently, when the newer movies started coming out, I sat down with him and showed him one of them that I wanted him to see, because I know it speaks to an aspect of his life and his work that would surely interest him. And of course, like anyone who was raised on Star Wars, to raise themselves on Star Wars, my children are fluent, and they know it as back and forth as me sometimes correct me on it. So we're into a fourth generation of Star Wars fans now. And this is a remarkable staying power. It's a remarkable shared language between people across generations who might not have other shared language. But if you're a Star Wars fan, you can all relate to a certain example of a negotiation in Star Wars. You can all relate to Darth Vader's attempt to recruit Luke over to the dark side. And maybe you hadn't thought about that as a negotiation back in the day, but if I speak to you about it in negotiation terms, you'll suddenly realize, so when he said to him, "Join me and I'll complete your training," he's speaking to Luke's interest in finding a teacher now that his teacher has been killed. Parentheses, he's been killed by Darth Vader, which might cause us to think something about how can we affect the other's interests and alternatives in a negotiation. Parentheses, don't kill the other person's Batna. Okay, that it's both illegal and it's not nice, but it's still something that we can relate to in negotiation terms. When Darth Vader says to Luke, "Join me and we'll rule the galaxy together," he's speaking to an interest. He assumes that Luke will want power. When he says, "We'll rule the galaxy together as father and son," he's assuming that Luke will desire this parental connection. So Darth Vader is actually a master of speaking to Luke's interests, or more, he sort of missed out on Luke's interest, but he was really trying. He was really trying to implement interest-based negotiation. And this from the most competitive person in Star Wars. So I can hold that conversation with anybody from 12 or even 8 to and up, who has seen the movie. So that's one thing about the younger generation. My children have read parts of the book, understood it, and enjoyed it. And my children, I'm speaking my 12-year-old son, my 15-year-old son, my 18-year-old daughter, and my 26-year-old daughter have all enjoyed this book at each at their own level, or in their own way of taking things. and people, I'm trying to think of at the other span, people in their 70s and perhaps even in their 80s have held long discussions with me about it. So that's one part of that. And another part of that is it would be really wonderful to put out a book more oriented at really young viewers, not at the younger generation necessarily, sort of the people in their 16 to early 20s, just because they are a younger generation. No, I mean, something that might really speak to the, the 7 to 12-year-olds who they've seen Star Wars or they've seen a few movies, and how could you write for them something that would give them conflict fluency early on? That is certainly on our list, on our please, please, please list. I hope we figure out how to do that.
Well, I was thinking maybe why not let them write something, because of how they have looked at those situations. Maybe look, the way I'm trying to promote mediation and these mediation circles that I want to create in schools and everything, I feel that they actually know so much in how to interact and resolve. I feel, I mean, I've spoken to some and I got that feeling. So I just felt that maybe we can pick up from them and let them also put out how they look at those
Yeah,
conflicts and how they want to
yeah,
resolve it. But then, in the movies, of course, you've gone through all of them, definitely. So in relation to the conflicts in those movies,
yeah.
do they mirror society in any way as change of society, because it's gone through many years? Do you see something happening there, which is
Yes, Star Wars has always um, uh, built itself out of the conflicts of its time. As George Lucas's the original movie uh, was reflecting George Lucas's response to the United States involvement in Vietnam, and that's where it started from. That's why sort of when the movies focus on a small, poorly armed, poorly organized band of resistors fighting the giant empire. He had Vietnam and the U.S. in mind, and of course, the U.S. then was cast in the role of the evil empire, as was the spirit of his outview of the U.S.'s war in Vietnam. Uh, and it spoke in messages that were sort of fit to that uh, post Vietnam generation, and then right on into the early 80s. So they were both the conflict sort of metaphors, or the real world conflicts in the background, matched that, and also sort of just the way people interacted then. Really matched perhaps the way people interacted in that period, the way such as relationships between the sexes. And you can clearly see, let's say, Han Solo, played by Harrison Ford, in the early movies, as being, machismo and very, he's sexist. He says things as he's trying to woo Princess Leia. He basically woos her by badgering and harassing her until she says, "I love you," and he says, "I know." Things that are somewhat difficult to watch nowadays. But on the other hand, they were very accurate in their time of how people spoke to another, and the same for all sorts of relationships then. But when you move forward in time, so there was a second set of movies that was released between 1999 and 2005, and then a third set of movies between around 2015 and 2019, and you can see the development from in those periods. In the second series, which was what's called the prequel trilogy, because they cast back in time before the events of the first movies, they deal with issues that were very much in the headlines then, such as democracy. What is democracy about? Is democracy worth fighting for, and how do you fight for it? How does democracy get corrupted? That was very much That was a huge issue. And second was how easy it is to slip into war, when wars seem just. And when you think about what was going on in the world in 1999 to 2005, these are huge topics then.
Yep.
So that's to the big picture that's going on. And when you look at sort of the more interactional issues, so you see, first of all, gender roles and gender interactions have completely changed. You have strong female characters who aren't, they're not struggling to be strong female characters against folks who are trying to put them down, like Princess Leia was in the earlier movies. Strong female characters like Padme Amidala she's a kick-ass leader in her own right, and she does things right that the male, particularly the Jedi, get wrong. For example, just as an example of one of the there's this treaty negotiation between Queen Amidala's people, the Naboo, and the Gungans, another species who lives on their shared planet of Naboo. And the Jedi they don't try directly to mediate, they try to coach one party into the wisdom of engaging with the other, and they fail. They absolutely fail. And yet Queen Amidala approaches it differently, and she succeeds in negotiating a treaty and an alliance with the Gungans, with this other species. And there are other examples of how she manages to do that wonderfully. There's a chapter in our book about lessons from women leader of Star Wars, which both focuses on the women characters and also discusses gender differences in negotiation. And sort of back to the there's a lot more to work with in that regard. The more the series moves on in years, because we know much more about women and negotiation now. Not only women in negotiation, let's expand it. Gender in negotiation, right? It's not just women who have gender. Gender in negotiation, which involves how women tend to negotiate, how people of other genders tend to negotiate, which is an understudied topic, and of course the interactional aspects, how men interact with men, how men interact with women. And then, of course, expanded into intersectionality, for instance, of race. And we know much more about all that now than we knew back then. And you can see that developing in Star Wars. So you see a lot more gender equality in those early 2000s movies. You see women in combat roles, without it being a question or an issue. You see women in leadership without it being an issue. The third set of movies, they return to the theme of a small band of resistance against an evil empire, which seems to sort of have become anew a question in the world. It takes on themes of the ills caused by capitalism, including the violence caused by capitalism, not just both structural violence of the impacts of capitalism on lower classes, but also just the amount of violence that is both conducted in the name of capitalism and the way in which capitalism serves all parties to conflict and just sits around and benefits as people die. Those are powerful themes throughout the later three trilogies. The topic of race is much more pronounced in the later trilogy. You see representation of people from, I'd say, all across the racial spectrum, but then of course there are those that I've missed or I didn't notice, whether based on my own privilege or just because there are difference. But at last, there are people in key roles, people of all colors, and those are issues in even the latest Star Wars material, which is mainly TV shows. There was a leading role done by an African American transgender person. Star Wars is very much intentionally, both in casting, in storyline, and in themes, it is trying to match what's going on in there to the issues that are on the minds of our generation, of each generation. And therefore the conflicts that come up are conflicts that are grounded in the conflicts of the generation, whether it's the big picture conflicts or it's the ways in which we interact now. So Star Wars continues to be relevant, to be actual, to be contemporary, both in terms of storyline, but also in terms of conflict material and conflict resolution interaction. And I anticipate, I mean, that's clearly intentional. So that's going to continue on into the next generation.
I'm just thinking from what you're saying that actually how important it is, because movies, of course, reach out to so many people, and I'm sure Star Wars must have gone into so many people, into so many houses. So in relation to conflict resolution itself, the way it is done, how you are actually putting out lessons to people in a way. I mean, of course, whether they're actually considering those lessons from the movie or not, but somewhere subconsciously something is going in. So maybe shouldn't people like you be part of when the script is made for movies in general, not just Star Wars, in movies in general?
Listen, I would be very, very happy to get that call, right? Or I'd be even happier for Jen to get that call, right? And to have Disney on the other line saying, hey, we think we need a negotiation consultant in on this film. That would be wonderful. Listen, and it wouldn't be the first time. If you think about, there have been some instances in which shows recognized that they needed this expertise. I don't know if you've seen the series The Good Place, which was a show on.
I started that. I started a few episodes. I saw a few episodes of that. Yeah.
Okay. Keep going. It gets better and better. That's my recommendation. They had a philosophy consultant on the show. How would they have written that without a philosophy consultant? The Big Bang Theory, a sitcom that ran for 11 seasons, had a scientific consultant because the four of the lead characters were doctors or professionals in the sciences, and they were professionals of science. So they needed that scientific consultant both to convey actual science and also sort of scientific culture. I think it would be a wonderful idea for Star Wars to have a negotiation consultant or a conflict consultant or a conflict resolution consultant. I know that there many times shows don't invest in this. I can give an example. A few years ago, the entertainer, rapper, and all sorts of other things, Ice-T in the US, decided to put on a show called The Mediator. And it was a show in which, just like, sort of like a Judge Judy sort of show, if you're familiar with that, but it's sort of the show where two parties come and they have a quarrel, and sort of they bring it in front of Judge Judy was an arbitrator or a judge, and Ice-T was supposed to be a mediator, and he sort of helped them work it out. Which, of course, he generally didn't, and defaulted to telling them what to do, of course. But more to the point, I have some friends. I thought about doing this myself, and didn't. But I do have some friends who actually did write that letter, and they offered their services to the production, and they said, we'd be happy to come on board as mediation consultants. The show is The Mediator. And the response of the production was, from what they shared with us, was if you pay X amount of money, and it was a six-figure in dollars amount of money, we'll give you a credit saying that you were the consultant to this. But they didn't want their expertise. They didn't. It was just a way to up the revenue of the show. So I don't know, if we'll ever get that call, but any one of our authors and any one of the people who participated in the project, there are many other people who are participating in the project, like they submitted proposals we were unable to include. they're submitting to the second book. So we have dozens and dozens of people who could serve in that role pretty well. And that's even beyond the fact that it could be that just, your non-Star Wars mediator or negotiation expert would be able to serve in that role as well. They'd have to learn a lot of Star Wars in order to really be able to find the best way to consult. Just like in any situation we walk into and need to learn more about what's going on.
Yeah. No, I was thinking in terms of the movies because they have a major influencing power throughout the world in various ways. Of course, I do discuss the negative part of it about how alcohol has been promoted in the world through Hollywood, and it becomes something that, oh, you are not living if you're not having alcohol, and you walk into someone's house, a beer is thrown at you, everything is wine, and you can't have conversations. Even in law firms, a bottle is opened when you're just having a casual conversation. So they've pushed it so much into people's psyche that they feel they're not living life, they're not drinking alcohol. So they have such a major influence on society. So why not this aspect? Why not conflict resolution by itself? In a way, it's a responsibility. I would think it's a responsibility for them.
It would be wonderful for them to see it this way. I know that, as from what I've heard, Indian television movies do have limitations on that, from this responsibility aspect in terms of, I think, both alcohol and cigarettes. Maybe I'm
now just a little disclaimer has to go down. That's all. Little disclaimer.
Oh, that's it. Though I thought it was more.
Smoking is injurious to health. Advertisement, because advertising is not allowed. So look, they have to push it. They'll push it through whatever. So now they've gone down to little disclaimer. Smoking is injurious to health, but the smoking is going to happen, and all that is going to happen. Drinking also same thing. So it's now a disclaimer, but it goes on.
Yes. So I wish that Hollywood and all other Hollywoods across the world would see that as a responsibility. And there are ways to do that without making the shows boring. And I mean that, let's take this into the context of Star Wars. I mean, a lot of the appeal in Star Wars is that people don't resolve their conflicts peacefully, right? Is that the flashing lightsabers and people blasting at each other with blaster guns, and the spaceship battles in outer space. That's a lot of the appeal to many fans in Star Wars, including a 4-year-old me. Let's not, right? I'm no different than anyone else, and including a 49-year-old me who can appreciate that. But there's more to it than that, and actually that's the subtitle of our book. The book is called Star Wars and Conflict Resolution. There are alternatives to fighting. And that's not just a sentence we made up. That's a sentence that one of the wisest Jedi in the saga, Obi-Wan Kenobi, said right in the original movie. He said this to a Han Solo who was about to take on a huge battle station head on in a suicide attempt, a suicide mission, just because he wasn't going to let them take me without a fight. And Obi-Wan put his hand on his shoulder and he said, "You can't win, but there are alternatives to fighting." And in essence, so much of what we do is just putting that hand on the shoulder, right? And Star Wars does that on occasion very explicitly in all sorts of ways. I think that the more Star Wars behind the scenes knew about these methods and how to do it well, the more it would be able to incorporate them into the movies, not in order to make the movies a tutorial about conflict resolution. It's called Star Wars. It's not Star Good Conversations, right? But they'd be able to use these situations in which there are conversations, successful or unsuccessful, to do it just a little better, a little more intentionally, so that whatever the message about the opportunities that you can have, the range of styles you can adopt, the ways in which you can be constructive and unconstructive would just be a little sharper. And then that message would get across clearer, not in a directive way. You need to work out your differences. No, that doesn't work. It doesn't work in kindergarten. It doesn't work in the mediation room. It certainly wouldn't work in Star Wars. It would be boring and artificial in Star Wars. But there are so many negotiations in Star Wars in which just a little more skill, style, and knowledge as to what's behind that would be so helpful. And I think Disney has this sense of responsibility regarding other issues. Like there's this scene in which a much younger version of Obi-Wan Kenobi walks into a bar, and he sits down at the bar, and a young man approaches him and says, "Hey, you want to buy some death sticks?" Like he's offering him some form of drug. And Obi-Wan uses a technique called a Jedi mind trick, which allows you to sort of alter the other party's thinking and perceptions of reality. And he says, "You don't want to sell me death sticks." And the young man says, "I don't want to sell you death sticks. You want to go home and rethink your life. I'm going to go home and rethink my life." So there's an overt, don't take drugs, kids, sort of message, and of using your powers for a specific good, even though, being anti-drugs is not necessarily, it's not a part of the movies. It's not on the Jedi agenda. It's not on the, it's not, it only comes in later on some of the TV shows, and even then. So it's really interesting that they put that in, and there's that. So they did see that as a point for responsibility. People don't spend too much time drinking in the shows. They're intended as family movies, as sort of in the American sense of what that means. So I wonder if there could be that sort of intention. Hey, we are actually educating people about all sorts of things. Can we do that a little more intentionally without detracting from the fun of the movies, from the essence of the movies, and from the guns and blasters and lightsabers of the movies? What can we add into that? Okay, that's a wonderful theme. You see, I can hardly stop talking about that.
What I'm going to do is, again, let me go back a little bit to the chat GPT. I just want you to correct it if it was wrong, because of course, where mediation was used is where what was asked. And I mean, factually, is this correct? First of all, to start with.
No, not really. In fact, absolutely not. The first one, they don't travel there for that purpose. They are unable to reach an agreement, even to the extent that they did negotiate. They hardly negotiated. Real nerds of Star Wars will consider that in the novel, not in the movie, there was more negotiation. It too ultimately failed, and they did not prevent the outbreak of the war. The war broke out in that one. In episode 3, Amidala and Skywalker traveled to the planet of Mustafar. No, they did not. They did not. There was no negotiation intended there. That wasn't their purpose in going there, and that had nothing to do with how the conflict escalated into the Clone Wars. In fact, if anything, that scene on Mustafar was the end of the Clone Wars. I won't get into that. Episode 4, no, that's absolutely wrong.
So what
episode 9.
So what we can do is that this could have happened. They could have done this. Maybe that's what it's going to be. So it's not, this did not happen.
Well,
yeah, maybe. I don't know.
The fandom of Star Wars is immense, and a lot of what sort of nourishes the fandom of Star Wars isn't only the creations of Lucasfilm and Disney now, of Star Wars artifact, authentic, top-down Star Wars artifacts. There's also a huge world, galaxy, I should say, of fan-driven, fan-created activity, material, and ideas. So this can take the form of art. This can take the form of fan fiction. In other words, fans writing Star Wars stories or alternative histories in Star Wars, in which, and in these alternative histories, all of everything that ChatGPT there just said could have taken place. It could be the theme for an alternative history. In fact, I think that's, one thing we might see is that ChatGPT, you've just demonstrated how it's a wonderful generator for ideas for fan fiction in Star Wars. And one reason that fan fiction or fan art and fan activity in sort of different comic conventions, so fan conventions. It's such a nourishing part of the fandom because, just as we know in mediation that when parties are a part of the process, not just in doing what we tell them, but rather they bring themselves and their idea and their creativity and their interactions and ultimately their creations and decisions, when they bring all of those into the game, they are empowered. And by means of this empowerment, they become more committed to the process. By means of this empowerment and committed to the process, they're more likely to, to gain a more sophisticated view of everything that's going on. They're more likely to remain with the process till an end of some sort or another. And if they've reached an agreement, they're more likely to remain committed to that agreement. So the impact of empowerment on long-term commitment is something that's sort of accepted as a truism in our field, and certainly true in the Star Wars universe. And in that sense, this book, another way to look at it is that it is a fan-created Star Wars artifact in which we've cast spotlights onto unexplored areas of Star Wars, not because we're telling new stories, like let's say ChatGPT just did, or alternative stories, but because we're showing Star Wars as it probably has never been shown before. Some people have done this sort of in tiny bits and pieces, might have used Yoda as an example, certainly, like lots of people have done that. I've done that for many years. All of our authors, I'm sure, have used like scenes or examples from Star Wars for many years. And Brad Heckman in New York has done a lot of drawings of Star Wars figures and their conflict-related sentences. And other people have mentioned bits and pieces along the way, or written a blog piece or something about, but sort of, not systematically is the wrong word, but really in depth, showing what insight the realm of conflict engagement and conflict resolution can offer to understanding Star Wars. That's brand new. And that is sort of a brand new offering out there to the world of fans who want to know more about Star Wars. It also works in reverse, in the sense that Star Wars offers a wonderful array of situations, conversations, interactions, negotiations, arguments, fights, diplomatic incidents, and anything else that we can use as examples, and B, that we can use in order to test our theories against. So this is sort of two different things. One is using it as examples, and that's one of the things, that's the thing we do in the book. So if we're using this as examples, so we have a two-way street. We're teaching Star Wars fans something new about Star Wars, and we're also using Star Wars to teach them something new about conflict. The interesting thing that's going on is that Star Wars has started to teach us, as the authors of the book, it started to teach us more about conflict as well. We see things in Star Wars that don't fit our models, or we see things in Star Wars, some of our authors have noticed things in Star Wars that just made them think in a new way that somehow a dozen or 100 or 1,000 times sitting in a mediation room and watching certain types of conflict never brought them to think quite that way, but a scene in Star Wars brought them to think of, and they went back to the books and came up with new questions or new theory. And and now we plug that back into the theory to practice the theory circle and figure out what can we learn about conflict from Star Wars. So there's a lot going on here.
That's interesting. But I'm going to go back a little bit back to ChatGPT, only because the question I asked, because you said it's wars, Star Wars. So I said, why do you think the conflicts were not resolved amicably? So this is what
Excellent
the answer.
Question. Okay. So I'll just summarize what they're saying. So one reason they say is that definitely the large picture conflicts are between ideologies and deeply held beliefs, fundly opposed to one another, like the Jedi and the Sith, the Rebel Alliance and the Galactic Empire. later on in the later movies, the Resistance and the First Order. So all of this, that's correct. And there's a study there's a lot of study in our own galaxy of the nature of these sort of values-based conflicts, which are often the most intractable conflicts of them all, whether based on religion or other values. So that ties into a great amount of study that we do here in our world. Another reason is that the conflicts in Star Wars often involve characters who have personal grudges or desires for power or control. That matches our own universe, and it matches Star Wars. Their examples aren't precisely correct. In particular, it's Palpatine, who has this personal vendetta against the Jedi, particularly in the beginning, more so than Darth Vader. Darth Vader does join in on that. Both Darth Vader and particularly Emperor Palpatine, again, desires power, ultimate power, as he puts it, and that certainly plays out in our galaxy. I think that the first thing that came to mind thinking about current events is that when you look at Russia's invasion of Ukraine, this paragraph would seem to map onto that on both arms of this another reason paragraph. And then finally, the Star Wars movies often depict a struggle between good and evil. The forces of good are fighting to restore peace and freedom. The forces of evil are fighting to maintain their power of control. So it's difficult for sides to reach an amicable resolution. And I would say yes, but I take that one step further in the sense that this is a matter of perception. In Star Wars, the more you think about it, and the movies, particularly, the more the movies develop, this particularly in the what's called the prequel trilogies, the 1999 to 2005 movies, and then in the Clone Wars series, a cartoon series that came out after that, you suddenly recognize that the good versus evil of the original trilogy in the 70s is far less pronounced. And what you really has is that, everybody believes that they're on the side of good and right. But we know that from our conflicts. I'll say in the room again, but that in the room, I mean under the tree. There's no difference in the room, under the tree, online. We all, in our own story, we're always the good guy. Forgive me the gendered phrase. We're always the hero of the story, and the other part is the antagonist and the person in our way of our just cause. And that's true of most parties to conflict. Bernie Mayer, who I know you had on your show perhaps more than once, but you had it in the Neutrality Symposium, of course. So he's written and often says that one of the greatest mistakes that we tend to make when we're in conflict is the assumption that our counterpart is either crazy, evil, or stupid. And often we think all three of those about our counterpart. And that's an instinct that think back on your own conflicts in your own life and think about how often that is true, right? And he says, that's how we think about these things, but it really is rarely true. And particularly, it's perhaps never true when you look at it from their perspective. From their perspective, they and what they are doing is wise, just, the right thing to do, and a pretty savvy and smart way to handle the situation, again, from their point of view. And when you look at that, then as awful as it sounds to say, I'll jump directly to an extreme case. Hitler was not the bad guy in his own mind, not to justify him, but from a conflict and from a real analysis of conflict. Saying the West were the Allies were the good guys, and Hitler and his accomplices were the bad guys. It might be true in an objective sense. It certainly wasn't true from the window of Hitler's fortress on a mountain, right? And when you think about conflict that way, you'll get a far more nuanced look into conflict, and as a participant in conflict, whether you're a party or a third party, you'll understand a great more about how these are working, how things are working out. In Star Wars, Darth Vader, who might seem like an armored monster of evil the first times we see him, but from his perspective, he was doing the right thing. Emperor Palpatine, who's evil even to the point, portrayed as evil and crazy, even to the point of giving that sort of supervillain cackle of laughter when he discusses his evil plans. There's very little of that in Star Wars, but there is this point at which Palpatine sort of does that. But usually he doesn't. And so from his point of view, he's generally, he's playing out a plan that he laid. It's a plan that is 80 or 100 years in the running throughout the saga. Everything is going just as he has foreseen, and he is trying to correct a historic wrong against him and his belief and his people, and he's trying to do it by means of killing all of the Jedi and bringing the entire galaxy under his despotic thumb. But that's a good thing, if you ask him. And the conflict lessons in this are simply enormous. When you think about our own conflict. So in that sense, ChatGPT might have gotten some things right and some things wrong.
But I mean, sorry,
but
please.
But either one of them, they provide food for thought. And Star Wars examples. So ChatGPT got many of those just factually wrong. But then you have to remember that we all perceive situations differently, right? If you would see the movies, and then I'd ask you, what did you see? And I tell you what I saw. So, this is a truism in conflict. So we see different things. We've noticed different things we've taken in. We prioritize different things as important and just forgot other things, and we have the whole sort of ladder of inference and ladder of understanding, and how we intake information, sift it, select it, understand it. It runs through our cognitive biases. This is all material that we work with. We know people experience the same event perhaps in radically different ways. And in that sense, the way any two people see Star Wars is different. And that's really important to say, that anything we said in the book or in talks we give about conflict or in Star Wars, and anything I've said today is only, it's meant to engage with Star Wars fans who want to know a little bit about conflict. But one mechanism it's doing so is by starting a debate. Star Wars fans love to argue Star Wars. And we recognize that for every word we've written here about Star Wars, there's no, wait, you don't understand. And that's great. So use the term we just introduced, right? This conflict term, to tell us why we're wrong. And we totally didn't get that character, or we misunderstood that scene. Wonderful, right? That's what we do all day when we meet other Star Wars fans at conventions or just, and hang out. So why not do that around the topic of, here are a few topics that, we could learn from talking about them. So if anybody wants to argue that, that Obi-Wan Kenobi, his conflict style isn't X, as I wrote in the book, but rather it's Y, because look at this scene and that scene and that scene. Outstanding. I'd love to have that conversation. And that's why, the book is it's just an opening. And I think that, Star Wars develops from its fan arguments. There are some pretty awful fan arguments in the Star Wars universe. Some of them go to racist places, and some of them go to sexist places, and some of them are really awful. But the great majority of them are just people who are in love with a story and want to analyze it microscopically in every possible way. And that's exactly what we want to fit in with, and offer a few more frames, because we think that this will ultimately not only be fun, but also result in this more widespread conflict literacy that we're aiming for.
Let me know. We spoke about reaching that one person. So there's Susan who's commented, thanks. This has been an interesting discussion. I just ordered the book. I look forward to seeing how I can use it in my regular mediation practice and in my conflict resolution course. So
That's so
Susan,
wonderful. Susan, you're today's one person.
one
That
among
makes me
many,
so
I'm sure.
happy. Yeah, I hope, I know this will be posted on YouTube afterwards. If anybody listens to this and suddenly realizes, hey, I'm that one person today, whatever point in the future, I hope you'll add that in the comments. You're all very, very invited to be every day's one person. Of course, to be in touch with Vikram, if you'd like to speak to his side of how these things are playing out, or different areas of mediation are playing out, but also with me and other members of the project. You can find us, to make it simple, our website is starwarsandconflictresolution.com. And to make sure you can't get confused, if you're wondering, wait, is it with the end or without the end? It doesn't matter. You'll find us. Or just Google Noam Ebner Star Wars, you'll find us. And we're really easy to get a hold of. So share if you have a question, or if you have thoughts, or if you have an idea for a chapter that you'd like someone to write, or if you're a conflict and negotiation expert and you'd like to join, you're into Star Wars, or you're into a completely different series and you'd like to be a part of this project, drop us a line. We'd love to get to know you and to work with you.
So you started something which is of course going to keep growing, and you'll keep getting these inputs. But tell me one thing, of course, look, movies are made by people who have a certain thought process, but according to you, in the movies, do you see this aspect of seeing the good in the evil and the evil in the good? Does it come out from these movies, or is it supposed to be just one-sided kind of thing?
No, so right, like in the older movies, it is extremely one-sided. It is very one-sided. There's the good guys against the bad guys. And then as the plots develop, we recognize that there are other things happening in there. And therefore, in the sequel movies, in the prequel movies, the second series that came out, there are these moments where you see the good, you see the good guys in all sorts of ways. You see them being corrupted in all sorts of ways. And you also see them wondering, wait, are we the good guys? And there's this moment in the third movie where Queen Amidala, Padme Amidala, who we mentioned several times now, she asks, what if we've become the very evil we've been trying to fight? And the answer is, of course, that they have, unwittingly and unintendedly, that they've both been manipulated into becoming the evil they were trying to fight, and they've been fooled into becoming the evil, but they've also become that evil because of different areas in human nature that made them susceptible to that. They were that the galaxy, the politicians in the galaxy, or the Jedi Council, the Jedi themselves, the heroes of these movies, or all sorts of other figures, were susceptible to corruption, were susceptible to a zero-sum mindset, were susceptible to our way or the highway, were susceptible to thinking that they had ownership of what's right, and lost touch with what was on people's minds and what people's interests were. And at some point, they became, in different ways, they became instruments that unwittingly served evil. And that really gave a lot of people cause to think. And in the fandom afterwards, even before anybody said anything about conflict resolution, it was really interesting to see at that point that you saw a whole branch of the fandom sort of develop, idealizing or rooting for the people who are the bad guys in the movie. There are a lot of Star Wars fans who are, generally speaking, they're fans of the dark side, without getting into it. They're fans of the Sith. They identify with the Sith agenda. They identify with the Empire more than with the rebels. I mean, I'm not a Star Wars historian, but I think this particularly started to evolve after this second series, because the second series showed the Jedi not as this absolute, heroes, good or bad, that need to fight back and bring the light back to this dark galaxy, but as people who dropped the ball in the first place. They messed up, and that the Sith were a counter movement or a counter revolution to that, rather than being, the evil that overthrew the good. When you take this to the later movies, the last movies to come out, you see this addressed directly with Luke Skywalker, who represents the Jedi. Sorry, he comes straight out and says the legacy of the Jedi is failure. We messed up the galaxy. We thought we were the heroes, we were the legends, we knew what was right, and we totally forgot. We totally failed to see that this other movement, which would cause so much harm and suffering in the galaxy, it was growing right under our noses. In fact, we grew it. It grew up inside of us. We trained the lead players who brought so much evil to the universe. So this notion of, wait, so what is good and what is evil, and how much more complex is this whole thing, is a lesson that has become a core Star Wars lesson as Star Wars has developed throughout the years, and it's becoming very, very sophisticated as Star Wars goes along.
So I'm just looking at it from the perspective of, in general, in society in general, have people started questioning these things, and over time has, like I said, mirroring society and mirroring the contemporary thought process into movies, and movies doing that, how that works. But the fact that maybe was it that at one point of time you were told this is the good and that's the good, and today have people started questioning this aspect? Has that changed, and that is why it's reflected there? I mean, I don't know what your thoughts on that are.
Yeah, well, the way people, the way it's intended and the way it's written, right? Like we said, everybody experiences movies differently, right? So intentions aside and objective analysis aside, the extent that anything's objective, and understanding or preference aside, just as a simple example, many people, let's say in the US, many people would watch like the old movies of Star Wars and identify with the rebels because the rebels are the good guys, and not fully understand that that George Lucas didn't intend the rebels to reflect America, right? America was the bad guys in those movies, and that very often that the metaphor of the evil empire in across the Star Wars movies has to do with America's place in the world, and the less benevolent sides of that role in the world. It's not a direct it's not always a direct metaphor, but it's there, and it's quite possible to view Star Wars and from sort of inside American culture to still identify with the rebels and the little guy, because that's a part of American culture, right? We identify with the individual and not with the large faceless group in which everybody's identical in service of the great leader. So people still manage to identify with the rebels and not recognize that actually that's not what the movie intended to portray. There are other examples in which people might not get the message intended of casting people of color in a certain role, or people might not get the message intended in different modes. Really, in anything, even inside Star Wars, I think this might be a direct cinematic response to it. In in the seventh movie, there's this sub-story about Luke Skywalker and his nephew, Han Solo and Princess Leia's, General Leia's son. whose name is Ben. My own son's name is also Ben. Ben was a powerful Jedi trainee who turned to the dark side, away from the Jedi, and adopted the name of Kylo Ren, and now he's trying to advance a dark agenda and to destroy the Jedi. And there was this struggle as he was turning to the dark side. There was this scene in which he had an encounter with his uncle Luke Skywalker, his teacher, and something happened. And we're shown that scene from several different viewpoints. From Luke, as he preferred to tell the story. From Kylo Ren's side, as he experienced that story. And then later on, from Luke, when he shared more of the reality and truth, even the painful truths of what happened in that scene. So we have this really explicit Rashomon situation. And I think that, and so the who's the good guy and who's the bad guy, who's the offender and who's the victim is explicitly complexified. So back to good and evil, right? It's explicitly complexified. And I try not to make cinematic or literary critique and discussion because I focus on conflict. But as a fan and as a viewer, I think that this was a situation in which the creators were trying to tell us something about good and evil, and about and also perhaps about conflict. Is that good and evil it's a point of view, and good and evil is how we experience things. But there's more than one side to the story of conflict. There's more than one side to good and evil. And in a very, very simple manner, two parties to the same thing, back to the Bernie Mayer point and other points, we experience all of these situations subjectively, we process them subjectively, and we reach different conclusions as to what happens, who is right, and what a just outcome or resolution to it would be. All in our minds, and often completely, perhaps diametrically opposing the other party.
But no, if you, of course, you won't get time to watch whatever is on my channel and whatever discussions I've had. But one aspect of heart, soul, spirituality being part of in relation to the mediator, the process, and the participants is something that I have spoken about. Does any of that come up in these movies?
Well, the notion of neutrality, sometimes it very little explicitly, but it does, particularly in material beyond the movies. There's an entire world of development beyond the movies, of TV shows, of books, dozens, hundreds of books, computer games that have elaborate stories. And the topic of neutrality does come up more there. So let me give an example. For example, the Jedi have this role of bringing peace and justice to the galaxy, and this is a mix of being sort of enforcers of some sort sometimes for the Senate, the central government, and sometimes and they wouldn't call themselves enforcers though. And sometimes it's more that they're there to negotiate or coach or mediate and bring peace in different ways. So they often have that role. In the movies, we see them reluctant to intervene in internal affairs, even when those internal affairs are not to their liking. Like they don't intervene in slavery. They encounter slavery in episode 1 on Tatooine. The Jedi involved, they put a great deal of effort into liberating one slave who would, who they thought would become a Jedi. But they said flat out, we're not here to free slaves. And of course, anyone watching the movie said, wait, what? Aren't the good guys supposed to free? And part of that involves, while not justifying it in any way, but just explaining it from the internal story, is that Jedi tend not to intervene within sort of the customs and the internal laws and the traditions of the local culture. There's a lot to unpack there. So that's a form of neutrality, sort of neutrality towards issues. Much like, let's say, it's not a good it's a weak comparison, but the comparison stands. Like, as mediators, we're not supposed to, like in a divorce conflict, we're not supposed to have, perhaps, strongly developed ideas about whether the mother or the father should retain custody of the child, or people who hold with strict neutrality of mediation would certainly say that's up to the parties. My notions, or how I grew up as a child, or how I mother my son or daughter, has nothing to do and should be kept out of the room. So I mean that's a direct parallel. In the books, there's actually direct discussion of this. There's a book called Outbound Flight. For if there are any nerds out there who have ever gotten into the expanded universe and into the books that are considered canon in the Star Wars universe, just as much as the movies. So there's this book, and it involves a group of Jedi who set out beyond the known territories of the galaxy in order to colonize new planets and develop new outposts there. And they take many just ordinary people, engineers and farmers and people who are teachers who are intended to populate these new settlements. The notion of colonizing isn't heavily questioned there, but the notion of mediation is, because there's this new society right now. It's aboard a spaceship, and it's headed out to land on a planet or planets, and so the question of how does a society function? And here the Jedi get into their role as peacekeepers, and specifically as mediators. And let me tell you, the discussion of mediation, both techniques and values there, is as in-depth and full of jargon, just as much as any of the conversations at mediator conferences. It's really astonishing. But here it is, in the context of a particular world, of particular disputes, the question of what does a mediator do when they have parties to a conflict? Who should be involved in the conversation? A. Should it be done by one mediator, or are more than one involved in doing it? B. Those are familiar questions. The question of, should the mediator ever dictate what the outcome is? Well, that's familiar. We might say, oh, no, that's not included. But, well, we know that is sort of, we do need to talk about that. The question of a mediator proposal. Should the mediator, let's not dictate, but propose, and when? What's the value of it? What are the pros and cons, not just on a values-based level of, let's say, facilitated versus evaluated, but also of the odds that it will be accepted, and how it will leave the parties feeling and committing. The question of how much force or leverage can mediators apply in different, all of that is discussed explicitly in this book. And I've seen it, and there are other, this is just the most explicit, but there are other books in which it's mentioned. So the Jedi have this role of mediator, and when they do play the role of mediator, the issue of neutrality is important. Other than that, you can see all sorts of situations throughout the movies in which it's not directly discussed. It doesn't set it up from a mediation perspective to discuss that, but you can certainly discuss it through these situations. Notice when someone could have taken a neutral stance but decidedly didn't, when someone was expected to take a neutral stance and didn't, when someone wanted to take a neutral stance but parties saw them as being unneutral. And these are all, key to our discussions of neutrality. There are all of these situations in Star Wars.
But then the Desmond Tutu quote, that of course was something which was the theme of that symposium of mine on neutrality, and let me just open that too. Yeah. Of course, I mean, that's part of this. this aspect, was it ever taken up? I mean, was that
Mhm.
something that came
I
up?
remember that. Yeah.
And like we had that discussion, who is the
Yeah.
mouse and who is the elephant kind of thing, all
Yeah.
that.
Right.
Did that
Yeah.
ever come up in the movies somewhere and take a
Um, the question of not in the context of neutrality, in the context of power, certainly. I mean, which is not. I know that that's not the core of Desmond Tutu's intention or quote there, but certainly the question of who's the elephant and who's the mouse here. We have a wonderful chapter that Rachel Viscomi from Harvard Law School wrote on different approaches to conflict in Star Wars. How the dark side or the Empire tends to have a power over approach. That power is built by amassing leverage, amassing different ways in which you can cause pain to everybody else, and then applying that power, weakening the other, separating the other, using power to gain more power. And that's a demonstration of what we call power over. And then on the other side, on the Rebel Alliance, or later the Resistance, and the Jedi also manifest this in some of their actions, is the notion of power with, which is power you build by forming alliances with people, by power you gain by being creative, by being constructive, and basically by bringing a lot more than brute force to bear on a particular topic. It's power in the service of a constructive outcome rather than power in the service of a crushing win-lose. And then, so the question of, what are the pros and cons of applying power over is with Star Wars right from the first movie, when Darth Vader and Grand Moff Tarkin are about to destroy a planet with this new Death Star that they have in the first movie, which you may have seen. And Princess Leia, who's present at that moment, she says, the more you tighten your grip, the more systems will slip through your fingers. Sort of discussing the limits of power. And then throughout both those movies and then all the movies to come, the rebels demonstrate a power with, the power of alliance, the power which includes the power of agreement, the power of negotiation, a more democratic approach to things, which ultimately trumps the power over approach. Since parties are so heavily embroiled in conflict, there's not a lot of direct discussion of neutrality in there. But to be honest, I think that our profession, the discussion of neutrality is, of course, so important, and it's getting increasingly important nowadays, as your symposium demonstrated, and as who Bernie Mayer has been talking about neutrality forever, and his new book,
neutrality trap?
The Neutrality Trap talks about how neutrality is becoming increasingly problematic given the times we live in. In other words, it is wonderful in service of certain types of situations and certain types of disputes, but particularly when you look at it at its societal in a societal perspective, we pay a price. So I do want to say, though, that that while this discussion of what is the role of the third party and what is the stance of the third party is really important, it's a topic we've been looking at in the conflict resolution, particularly in the mediation field, for the past 40, 50 years, right? It's a very robustly developed area, including a lot of axiomatic acceptance and then resistance to that axiomatic acceptance, but it continues to be developed, and it's not a gap in our field. However, really understanding conflict deeply and how parties to conflict feel, perceive, act is altogether less developed. Certainly, sort of, let's say, in the mediation field, let's say from a typical mediation training, we don't get deeply into how parties deeply experience conflict. The purpose of this typical training is more, how can we lead parties who are in conflict towards resolution, or offer them opportunities to lead themselves towards resolution? Do we deal deeply with how does a party see another party through a prism of rage? Right? It's not necessarily, it's not in depth on the curriculum. And while there is research out there in the broader conflict field on some of this, I think overall the conflict experience, the party experience in conflict is less developed. There's one book on this in a mediation perspective, written by Timea Talodi, which some viewers might want to look up. Talodi is Tallodi. But generally speaking, this is sort of a gap. We prefer to focus on resolution more than we do on conflict, and we prefer to focus on the more constructive aspects of things, rather than on like the deep building blocks of what makes a party get up in the morning and fight with someone else. What makes someone take up arms and go to war, right? What makes party bring themselves from, let's say, someone who is a mediator or a lawyer in their normal lives, but then everything changes and they, and they become a soldier by choice. They dedicate their lives to fighting violently for a cause. Star Wars is full of that. And Star Wars is increasingly becoming full of that, particularly as the TV shows develop the early formation of the rebellion against the Galactic Empire. And we start to see how ordinary, day-to-day citizens of this empire, how they make their decisions to resist, how they make their decisions to fight, how they make their decisions to remain neutral or just to avoid. So this is an area that Star Wars, I think, develops much more than the neutrality aspect.
But the only problem that you're going to face is that you're going to be polite and you will continue the conversation where you may want to leave, but you can't leave right now because, like, you're a Star Wars fan. I have a fan of mine who's put a comment which I have to read, and there is one question beyond that I have to ask you. So what does my fan say? The whole idea and conversation is brilliant. I make the image of the stars. Isn't it about the war between the stars of feelings, the love and wounded love, anger stars, and so many ego stars, such as in all conflicts? I will read for sure this inspiring book after a long time, like Vikram. Thank you. Okay. So anything on that? That's Mandy. Mandy is a fan. She says.
I'll say briefly, what a lovely world of metaphor that can offer us. In the book, we tried not to work with metaphor too much, but rather discuss the nuts and bolts of the actual story and characters of Star Wars, because that's how fans live it. But when you zoom out and you look at these things, so absolutely there is so much to do in the realm of metaphors, and that anonymous fan of conflict and of Star Wars who chimed in there has just you've taken your new step into a bigger universe, as Obi-Wan Kenobi said. So feel free to continue on and maybe put some of those thoughts down on paper.
That's not anonymous, huh? Not anonymous, as Mandy is her name, and she comes in for these shows. And
thank you, Mandy.
But the important thing is, like, I was wanting to get into the aspect of heart, soul, and spirituality. These are topics that I have discussed. And do those elements come up anywhere in relation to conflict resolution in the movies?
It's interesting. I mean, certainly comes up in Star Wars. These are stressed to or touched upon to different extents in the book, largely lightly. We already have proposals for the next book that deal more with issues that I would put, along the heart, soul, and spirituality trifecta or spectrum, depending on how you want to look at it. Already have a proposal on the topic of reconciliation of religion, of course, connected to conflict, because we're not writing generally about Star Wars. It would be easy to write about all three of these in Star Wars, but we need to take this as a perspective to which to look through at conflict in Star Wars. So at the core of one of the key hinges of Star Wars is Anakin Skywalker's turmoil, identity turmoil, between his heart and his mission, which involves his spirituality to the extent that the Force, this energy that's talked about in Star Wars, has a spiritual aspect, particularly for Jedi who have been raised in this tradition. He's in conflict between his heart that tells him that he would do anything for his beloved, and he would do anything for his friends, and his mind, his rational side that tells him, no, this is what you got to do, and also, his training, which I'll connect to the spiritual side, his understanding that the Force wants him to act one way, but it could be in direct opposition to his heart. So one chapter in our book treated this as a clash of, on the level of a clash of values, or a clash of values and interests. Another chapter in the book treated this as an identity clash, right? In which you could look between your spiritual side and your heart side, and the series hangs on this. Will Anakin turn or won't? Is the entire question of the prequel trilogy. The ramifications of that turn to the dark side is the topic of the original trilogy. He became Darth Vader, and Darth Vader brought all this evil upon the galaxy. So in that, it very much hinges. Spirituality is not addressed beyond sort of the notion that there is a force, and that some might look at it as a religion, some might look at it through spirituality, and others might see it as just a code of guidelines. The notion of the Force came from George Lucas's grasps of spirituality, right? I mean, those are the sources for the Force, and it's based on all sorts of lines of thinking, and mainly Eastern thinking. It's sort of introduced without a deep deal of development, particularly in the early trilogies. It was basically just a power that some people had. In the sequel trilogy, in particular, the last trilogy, the later trilogy, it's much more developed in terms of sort of how it functions and how it works and how to get in touch with it, but not too deeply. It's an inch deep. I think that there's a lot to be written, and there are a couple of chapters that perhaps might go this way, either in the next or the next book, about the role of religion and conflict. One is the notion of whether it's spirituality or religion, whatever the Jedi or Force are, we can see there's, if you look critically at the story of Star Wars, you can say what actually happened is that this religious figure radicalized a young, innocent farm boy who was living his life in some far-off corner in the universe, told him that some people in the galaxy were evil, and sent him off on a mission to kill them based on studying the precepts of this religion that he believes in, right? I mean, that is one way to read the story of the original trilogy. Of course, it's not the intended way to read it, but it is a way to look at it. And it's not fair to look at the bad guy story in our world, right? And say, well, that's the story of bad guys all over the world, right? And then not look at how actually that story happens in the services of what we think is good. Word for word, that's what happens. So when you look at it through that way, and I know that in this case I'm talking about spirituality purposed for violence and perhaps for evil, rather than spirituality as a core centering feature of an individual. But that's another aspect of how this could be a theme in Star Wars. And there are books written that are more directly on these themes, but not from a conflict perspective, right? So Star Wars and philosophy will deal more with some of these themes. There's a book called The Tao of Star Wars. I can't remember the name of the author, but which talks about Eastern philosophies and Eastern religion, Eastern spirituality, and Star Wars. So there are other and Star Wars books that take this head on. I'm waiting to see what people offer. We look forward to people expanding what we think Star Wars talks about by saying, no. It actually has very powerful messages about that in conflict. And that's the tricky part here. And that's again why we open this up to the world of conflict experts to bring their own view of things in, because I would have said, yeah, I don't think there's a whole lot of that directly pertains and that we can work with. Maybe this topic, maybe that topic, and someone else can come and demonstrate how this is maybe the central conflict theme in Star Wars, but Ebner, you're just not seeing it. I live for that.
Because I had a symposium on heart, soul, spirituality, and mediation, because the way I am promoting mediation is there is a human touch to it, the humanistic approach to it, of course, relationships and healing and all that kind of thing. Of course, look, if they will be practiced in different ways, people will have their different perception of mediation itself. So for me, those elements being an important part of the process, and from the mediator's perspective also from there. And of course, I mean, spirituality removed from religion. I mean, I'm not connecting the two. So that kind of a thing. So that we've had interesting discussions on that. I just felt that does that kind of element come through from the movies?
So let me add one element that does come through and quite powerfully, which is the element of hope. Okay, so hope is something that you could discuss, through a heart, soul, spirituality perspective, and you could also discuss it through an emotional status or a cognitive state, right? Essentially, it depends who you ask, right? If you ask an economist what hope is, she'll tell you one thing. If you ask a spiritual a scholar or leader what hope is, they'll give you a sermon on something else. If you ask a psychologist what hope is, they'll tell you something quite different. And that's true for a great many of the core elements that we work with in mediation. It's true for the element, let's say, of trust, right? It's true for all sorts of things. And hope is, when we look at mediation, we don't often talk about the role of hope. But one way to look at mediation is that one of our fundamental services to parties, and ways in which we empower and support parties in the room, is by instilling a certain amount of optimism into the room. And I'm not talking about false, cheery optimism. Oh, we're just going to talk and everything's going to be fine. No, but the notion, and we say this, probably many people say this in our introductions, like, this is a process that has the chance of bringing you into a different future, one that you want to, essentially hope. Essentially, optimism is the capacity to envision that things might be better at a future point in time, right? So in the end, optimism boils down to the ability to hope for something different. So in mediation, we offer some of that hope, and we also offer a plan, right? Some structure, a process. It's not just, well, let's get together and maybe things will work out for the better. It's optimism plus some degree of a plan, and what degree of a plan will depend on your approach to mediation. There is research. I'm not familiar with research in negotiation, but there's research in negotiation on the role of optimism and what optimism, as mainly looked at as sort of, I mean, it's looked at both as a psychological state, and it's also looked at as a personality trait, I think, and what its impact is on how people act in negotiation and their likelihood, in the focus of the negotiation word, the likelihood of achieving integrative outcomes. So seeing hope as a mediating factor in increasing integrative outcomes. So that's from the conflict and negotiation side. Hope plays much more of a role than we generally discuss. In Star Wars, hope plays a central role. Even you must remember back from that first movie, or from 1,000 memes and repetitions, that holograph of Princess Leia talking to Obi-Wan Kenobi at the very, very beginning of Star Wars and saying, "Help me, Obi-Wan Kenobi, you're my only hope." So hope is like, it's right there at the root of things. And this gets developed throughout the movies, in all sorts of ways. In the newer movies, in the movie Rogue One, which came out around 2016. I know there's a Star Wars fan out there correcting me, in which maybe in the chat. So
I'll open this.
There's this moment in which in which the most cynical character in the movie, perhaps one of the most cynical characters in Star Wars, Cassian Andor, explains to another cynical character, why he does the things he does, and how this whole rebellion functions. And he explains, rebellions are built on hope. Right? I mean, that's the essence of a rebellion, is you're rebelling against something hurtful and harmful, and you rebel because you have the capacity to imagine that you might change things for the better. And later on, she's internalized that message so much that she mirrors it, she reflects it back to him at a low moment of his own, and reminds him that rebellions are built on hope. And that continues to be a theme throughout the Star Wars movies. And I think that people's capacity for optimism and propensity to optimism and to embrace hope. While the psychologists will talk about personality aspects of it, I think that a lot of it runs through that heart, soul, spirituality aspect, and often, in complementary ways. So I think there's a lot of room to develop that further, more.
So now, of course, I think maybe we should close it at the hope part. Because I wanted to go into how family conflicts have been looked at and that kind of thing, specifics also. But I don't know. Look, for me, I'm telling you, these conversations, I love them so much. For me, time is not a factor. But obviously, for you, definitely it would be a factor. So what I think what you can do is maybe just kind of a wrapping up kind of a whatever you want to put across, and then maybe we can have another conversation with all your other
yeah.
we can do that at some other time.
Yes, please. As I said, invite them all. And you know what? I'm not much of a wrapper-upper. There's no bottom line here. If there's anything I'd like you to, ending on hope is such a great point. Maybe I'll take that just back to our project and say that, like rebellions, our project is built on hope. It was built on the hope that people would join us in writing, and we've been bowled over by the response to that, and continue to be. Now we've put out a call for paper for our second book, and it's on our website if anybody's interested. And we continue to be bowled over by the response. So that was one huge hope. we hoped that the conflict and conflict resolution world would find this interesting and helpful, and we've been delighted and overwhelmed by the response, and your invitation to me to come on and share this, and hopefully to other authors, is just, you know, a demonstration of this, you know, of this manifesting, and hopefully a good sign for our greatest hope of all. And our greatest hope of all, you know, in the end, it boils down to our, you know, Jen and my own most naive and wishful hope, you know, for a more peaceable world. So our hope along the way is that the public will find our book or talks like this, or, you know, the use of the Star Wars vehicle to convey this basic conflict literacy. We hope that it will resonate with people. We hope that people will buy the book, but not because, you know, not for the money, but because we hope people will buy the book and then give it to the, you know, to the person who needs to read it. And that person gives it to another friend, right? To the Star Wars person in their lives. You know, that's the reason why we and DRI, our publisher, we were in full agreement that this book needs to be an inexpensive book. I know that there's objective and subjective expensive, but we priced it at $15, whereas, you know, trade books in the field would cost $30 or $40, and academic books in the field could cost $200 and more. We want this to be a book that anybody can walk by and purchase sort of on a whim, on a that sounds like an interesting way. And our greatest hope is that many people will just have that whim. So just as you said, you know, one person today, one person tomorrow, that's the way it goes.
And of course, Elise, I don't know whether I'm pronouncing it correct, ELYSE, she's saying thank you for both of us. Thank you to both of us. But of course, but we did not get into the key takeaways, what you have behind you. I don't know whether they're key takeaways for, what is that? I mean, that's of the.
No, this is not, it's not key takeaways from the book. This is a Star Wars themed negotiation teaching tool I developed. And at some point soon, I'll put this on my website, on the Star Wars and conflictresolution.com website. If negotiation teachers would like to play this, it's a game that you can play. You can give your students to play. It explores, students sort of put themselves in the role of a Star Wars character who needs to negotiate and apply the principles of interest-based negotiation according to getting to yes. It will be up at some near point on the website. We want to develop an area called for teachers or teaching materials, because the book, while it's aimed for Star Wars fans, and therefore it's not sort of it can't be a primary textbook in an ordinary classroom, which could have Star Wars fans and non-Star Wars fans. It's certainly a supplementary book that teachers might want to use for a certain lesson, or to assign a certain clip from the films, or to assign a certain assignment. And of course, we're hoping, and we hope to develop it. We're also hoping others will teach it. Is, you know, a course on Star Wars and conflict resolution. Hopefully, a course that will be attended by people who would not attend a course on conflict resolution. Right? The people who won't come to my classroom or your classroom to take a training or an academic course, but they might come to a cool course, maybe offered as a general education course or a general course in an undergraduate program, right? Just for fun. And encounter an academic course that's also all about Star Wars and also teaches them conflict resolution. So we're also developing teaching material for these things. That's a long answer to a short question.
I think that's a good way to connect people to it. And I think thank you very much. And of course, I've got the pronunciation right. Elise says I've got the pronunciation right. So good. I've got the pronunciation right. So thank you. There's lots obviously to talk about this, and I'm sure you people will have, maybe we'll have another session on that. But let me just say this was a symposium on language and mediation coming up in February, so that I'm just putting it out there. Anyone wants to be part of it, they can get in touch with
Wonderful.
me.
Yeah.
And of course, if the books that I read, for some reason, talking books is something that's coming up next week. There's something on commercial mediation, the book there. And after that, I have contributed to a book that someone said Australia had come out with, mediation beyond COVID. So that is on the 8th of the Wednesday after that. So talking book seems to be the the next thing that's
Yeah.
happening. For a person who doesn't read books, that's a lot of books.
Well, people had a lot of time to write during COVID. Fortunate people had a lot of time to write during COVID. I wanna, if wrapping up with anything, it's wrapping up with thanks. First of all, with recognition. You sat here for 2 hours and discussed both ably and patiently a book you hadn't read, about movies that you vaguely remembered one of, and yet, wow. And more generally, your series, or your various series, and the work you do in both bringing people together and also creating this archive for everybody out there in the world, and for mediators who haven't discovered you yet, or haven't discovered the profession yet, or who haven't been born yet. And this is such a wonderful archive for all of us. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you very much. And just like you said about the book, pass it on. I keep telling people, please share these videos. There's so much that you people bring in that they should reach out to everyone out there. That's what I do, and that's the whole idea. So thank you very much. And of course, another session maybe we'll have with all your authors. I think that's
Lovely.
something which was missing here. Maybe all of them should have been there. So we'll do that again. So
thank you, Vikram. Thank you to all the viewers. Thanks.